So, good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, December, what is it? 20th? 20th. And the Tuesday before Christmas, which is this coming Sunday. And we are kind of blessed that we don't have to do a separate program for Christmas because that's taken care of in our Sunday program. This interesting background, it's a relief carving that dates from perhaps the 4th century AD, and was discovered in the island of Naxos, one of the Greek islands, and it's in the Museum of Byzantine and Christian History in Athens. And I was there a good number of years ago now, and this is a picture of it that I took. I've never seen anything quite like that, where the nativity scene only shows Jesus bound up in swaddling clothes, lying in the manger, and only the two animals, the ox and the ass, that are in attendance. And I've never quite been able to figure out the symbolism of those trees. One of them, I think, is a palm tree, and I'm not really sure what the other one is over on the other side, but they certainly do have a particular symbolism, and if anybody knows, let me know. For Christmas, we always have multiple masses. The tradition goes way, way back when, and it goes back, I think, in great part to the stational churches in Rome, where the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, would travel from one church to another at different times and celebrate Masses, because each one has a different character. In the Vigil Mass, we are still looking backwards, the evening Mass before Christmas, and of course the Vigil Mass is becoming more and more popular in most parishes, and the ones that I was in. Our greatest crowds came on Saturday afternoon, or the Christmas Eve afternoon. The earlier the better. We actually ended up having to do, I think, at one parish, 4 or 5 masses, beginning at 3:30 in the afternoon. And the early ones especially were packed with families, because it was so nice to have Mass. I don't want to say get it out of the way, but that was probably the reality. To have the Mass and then to go home and celebrate Christmas according to whatever the family customs were. But really, the Vigil Mass does not do justice to the celebration of Christmas because it looks backward. Now, a lot of our time today is going to be taken up looking at the Gospel of the Vigil Mass, because I've got a very, very strong interest in that. The Midnight Mass, with all of its splendor, presents to us not the great splendid people, but the shepherds, the poor, humble, dirty people who were not really part of the legitimate society a lot of times in the culture of that time. We, of course, have the appearance of the angels to them, but it's interesting that the angels appeared to the poor, humble shepherds, not to the folks who were the big shots of the time. He didn't make any kind of revelation to the Trump Tower of his day. At dawn, the emphasis is on light, the dawning of new light, the light in the darkness. And in the daytime, it sort of is the complementary celebration to the vigil, because the daytime looks to Jesus' divine origins, looks to the beginning of John's Gospel, and that's the one that we're going to be concentrating on today after we go through the genealogy. So let's go into this genealogy, the Vigil Mass Gospel. It's Matthew 1 to 25, and the genealogy of Jesus is about the first 2/3 of that reading. And I would say that most people want to skip it or find it tedious or annoying. Annoying is a word that I'm hearing more and more frequently with regard to things in the liturgy that people don't like. And I've heard that used with regard to this genealogy. Personally, I find it is a wonderful thing to be just recalling the name and the lineage of each one of these people who were the human ancestors of Jesus. And we'll see some interesting twists in this genealogy, this list of people that could go back to the time before Jesus and trace Jesus' ancestry and how we want to trace it. So it begins the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Notice how he begins going backwards. Jesus, David, and Abraham. Then he will go forward, beginning with Abraham and going up to Jesus. But to start out, we're with Jesus and looking backward. Son of David, son of Abraham. Both of those things are important to establish Jesus' pedigree as the expected Messiah, the anointed one, because he is king, as in David, and he also sums up the faith, the perfect yes. Well, it wasn't all that perfect, but it was nonetheless. The yes to God that Abraham did in his obedience. So in some ways, while Matthew concentrates on the legal paternity of Jesus and the establishment of his line through from Abraham through David, while Matthew concentrates on that, he also looks to Jesus as embodying the obedience of Abraham, and that it is from that obedience. And the word obedience actually means to listen carefully, to listen so carefully that you are taking the other person to heart and acting in accord with that other person because you have become one with them through obedience, through that listening. So taking the obedience of Abraham, Jesus does that perfectly, and it establishes the perfect covenant between humans and God. So, Abraham became the father of Isaac, and that goes back to somewhere around 1800 to 1600 BC. We really can't pin it down any better than that. Some would say it could go back as far as 2000. But then again, Abraham, while he may very well have been a real human person, individual, I think we would probably hold to that, but so much of his story has a mythic content. In other words, it's the story that establishes the patterns of how God relates to his people. So Abraham was called and tested, and he was obedient. And his son, Isaac, was a child of the promise, late in life, sort of like other folks that we have encountered in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Elizabeth, for example, late in life, Isaac was a child of promise. And Abraham was tested, in particular with this incident of, which is interestingly represented in art here, of the sacrifice of his son, his only son who would be his heir. And when his obedience was tested, of course, there's a lot of other things we could say about it, but when his obedience was tested, then God affirmed, well, let's put it this way, Abraham passed the test and spared Isaac and substituted a ram that was caught in a thicket instead. So Isaac was the father of Jacob. Now, you remember that Jacob and Esau were twins, and Esau came out first, so he had the birthright. He was the legitimate heir. And the name of Jacob was supplanter or deceiver. He was, remember, in his birth, he was grabbing hold of Esau's heel and kind of almost as if he were trying to get out first, but didn't quite make it. And the interesting thing about Jacob was he was a fairly unsavory character. He was a mama's boy, for one thing, and he used deception to obtain his birthright and his blessing. And yet he was also deceived by, and I didn't quite get that finished, he was deceived by his father-in-law when he went to marry and he fell in love with Rachel, and father-in-law, what's his name? Anyway, the father-in-law says, well, okay, you work 7 years and you can have her. And then after 7 years, he says, whoops, no, my oldest daughter is unmarried. You got to take her. And if you want Rachel, well, you got to work another 7 years. So he was a deceiver, but he also ended up being the victim of deception for the treasure that he wanted. And after that, he had that occasion where he dreamed of the ladder and then wrestled with the angel of the Lord. And he was renamed Israel, who is the one who wrestles with God. And he prevailed over that angel. The angel could not get out of his grasp, but he was wounded, and wounded in the hip, a dislocated hip. And so that kind of says something, too, about the human struggle with God, doesn't it? That we have all kinds of mixed motives. We have all kinds of things in our own background and in our own way of looking at things and doing things. And yet, this is a very interesting picture of that struggle. There is Jacob, and there the dark figure is the angel with a helmet and who has grasped his foot to dislocate his hip. But, we can prevail, but we often end up being wounded in our attempts to even to be faithful to God. Now, next one, Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers, the 12 brothers, and that whole business about Joseph. Well, Joseph doesn't enter into this at all. Even though Joseph was the means by which the brothers and Jacob were saved from famine by going down into Egypt, he doesn't enter into this at all. It's Judah, because at the end of his life, Jacob's blessing gives him the privileged role among the tribes. He was the lion, and he was the one from whom the scepter, the ruling power, would not depart. And I think that was significant for his lineage with Jesus. Now, that's in Genesis 49. And here we have a scene of an artistic representation of Jacob blessing Judah and blessing the other brothers. Then Judah became the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, Tamar is very important here because later in life, Tamar was the widowed daughter-in-law of Judah, whose first two husbands, Judah's sons, died. Well, one died and the other refused to have intercourse with her. And she played the harlot to get him to produce children for her. And that's recounted in Genesis 38. So this first woman in the genealogy is not the one who we would say one would be terribly proud of in their heritage, unless we see God's finger working in some very human ways to bring about the divine purposes. And so she not only had one kid by him, she had two twins. And there was a little competition there too, because Zerah stuck his hand out, and the midwife put a red silk thread around his wrist, and then he pulled it back, And Perez, or Phares, and that means breach, came out first. And so there too we've got a little competition. But Perez or Phares is the one that we are following here. This would be about the time when the family departed into Egypt during the famine. And remember, in Egypt, they grew fairly prosperous. Here we've got another interesting artistic representation of Tamar, seducing, if you will, sitting by the side of the road as a prostitute, seducing Judah. It's interesting, there is no word of condemnation or criticism for Judah doing that. That seemed to be acceptable for the guy, but that's the way things were. Next one, Perez became the father of Hezron. This would be in that first generation while they are in Egypt. We don't know anything about him except his name and the obvious thing that he must have been part of the first generation. And Hezron was the father of Ram, so that was during the time in Egypt. Ram was the father of Aminadab. We got a little bit more on Aminadab because his daughter was Aaron's wife. So he actually was Aaron's son-in-law. So now this is the time in Egypt, and we're getting into the time of the Exodus here. Given the time in Egypt, there were probably quite a few others, but those were the ones named. Aminadab became the father of Nahshon. So he would have been the brother-in-law of Aaron. And Jewish tradition has it that Nahshon led the Israelites into the Red Sea in the Exodus. In other words, he was the first one that stepped in the water, and the water parted when he began to wade into it. That's not in the Bible, but it is in Jewish tradition. And the Exodus happened around 1250 BC. So you can see they've compressed a lot of generations here in the recounting of that genealogy, but are really hitting the high point. So, as we'll see again, when he says so-and-so was a father of so-and-so, that could mean grandfather, that could mean great-grandfather, that could mean great-great-great-grandfather, that could mean somewhere down the line. He was a military commander during the sojourn in the wilderness of Sinai, but he did not go into the promised land because none of those original people entered the promised land during the 40 years. So Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon would have been part of the conquest of the land of Canaan, and he married the prostitute Rahab. And so she will be named in the next verse. He married the prostitute Rahab. She was the one who welcomed the spies coming into to kind of reconnoiter, search out the land of Canaan, and he sheltered them in return for safety for her family. Well, she not only got safety for her family, but she got Salmon too. This would be about 1200. So Salmon was the father of Boaz. Now we're getting into some interesting people. Mother was Rahab. We just talked about that. And in the time of the Judges, which was about 1200 to 1000 BC, we've got 200 years at least of the time of the Judges, and yet these generations are very much compressed. So Salmon was probably not the father of Boaz, who lived probably about 200 years later, but certainly the line of descendants is still there. And then we have, with Boaz, of course, the story of Ruth, who was the foreign Moabite woman who, the story of her fidelity to her mother-in-law after her husband had died, and the mother-in-law went back. And Boaz fell in love with her when she was gleaning the wheat from his fields, and she sort of positioned himself when he was sleeping to be to show her own openness and readiness to get married to him, and the rest is providential history, because Boaz became the father of Obed, and Obed is distinctive because he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. And we know the story of Jesse's 7 sons when the prophet Samuel came out to determine a king, and none of the sons were the ones that God wanted. And finally, don't you got another one? Oh yeah, well, there's a runt of the litter out there, David. He's out in the field. He's not good for much except tending the sheep. Well, bring him in. And that was David. And there's Michelangelo, David. And so we won't go into too much of David, except that David became the father of Solomon, whose mother, Bathsheba, had been the wife of Uriah. And so we know that, David being the one who is held up as the paragon of what the virtuous king should be, and the image of the Messiah, had this very significant great fall, where he not only committed adultery against Uriah, one of his military commanders, but had him killed so that her pregnancy by him would not be discovered. And then that baby died, and the second child was Solomon, who was David's heir. King Solomon seemed like the perfect successor to David, except that midway through his reign, he had all this reputation for wisdom and was at a time of peace and prosperity, but he began to succumb to not only the wiles and temptations of his many, many pagan wives. One of the ways that you secure peace, is to marry into alliances with other countries, and that's what he did, an awful lot of. And they brought their gods with them, and if you really want peace with us, you better worship our God too. Most of the people at that time were not like the Jews in that they expected only to worship their own God. That's what the Jews expected. Everybody else kind of said the more the merrier. You marry somebody who's a son of a king somewhere else, she brings her own gods. Wonderful, we've got another God. And keep him on our side. But he descended into idolatry and died out of favor with the Lord because of the influence of his many wives. Now, his son, Rehoboam, became king of the unified kingdom, but very shortly, the northern part of the kingdom, as we've looked at before. Remember, we have talked about the 2 kingdoms when we talk about the prophets, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, the north broke away at the time of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam remained the king only of Judah, and he reigned from 931 to 915. Now, he became the father of Abijah. Abijah tried to reunify the 2 kingdoms, but he failed. And he lapsed into idolatry, and he had a very, very short reign of only about 4 years. Abijah was the father of Asaph, or Asa. He had a long reign. He was well regarded as righteous. He tried to root out the idolatry that had been planted by his father and grandfather, and to restore morality and worship of the Lord. And for the most part, he was pretty successful. He had a long time to do it. Asaph became the father of Jehoshaphat, who reigned for 21 years. He continued the same program as his father Asaph and was regarded as a good and pious king, brought a time of peace and prosperity. We have an expression from our youth, jumpin' Jehoshaphat. It was a euphemistic expletive. In other words, you said that rather than saying something else that should not be repeated. And it was popularized, as I found, in the 1865 novel, The Headless Horseman, which I think Disney made a movie about. But that's just a little bit of trivia here. So there we have Jehoshaphat. These drawings here, they actually only come from the 16th century. So they were not portraits made by an artist of the time. Jehoshaphat became the father of Joram, or Jehoram. Now, this was confusing because there was a king of Israel with the same name at the same time. So, but we don't have to worry about that. He reigned for 8 years, and nice guy. He tried to secure his reign by killing his brothers. And he abandoned worship of the Lord. He'd done in 8 years, he undone pretty much what his father and grandfather had accomplished in half a century. But he died early from a painful abdominal disease. Some would say it serves you right. So there's Joram, who looks kind of sick right there, actually. Joram was the father of Uzziah. Now, there were several intervening monarchs. Joram was probably a great-grandfather of Uzziah. Uzziah reigned for 52 years, and he started out faithful. But he fell into false worship and ended up with leprosy as a punishment. And you see him with all the splotches of leprosy there, too. Uzziah became the father of Jotham. He reigned for 16 years, and he was a good king. But he was deposed by his son Ahaz with the support of the Assyrians. Now we're getting into kind of familiar territory because our first reading today and our first reading on Sunday was all about Ahaz. And what he did was he allied with the Assyrians, who destroyed the northern kingdom and made Judah a vassal state. And he was regarded as disastrous, simply disastrous. He adopted the Assyrian religion and customs. And the reason why we have that famous Emmanuel prophecy was that Isaiah said, come on, return to the Lord. And he says, oh, I won't tempt the Lord. And Isaiah says, listen, the Lord is going to destroy your enemies, but you'd better be on the Lord's side. And the Emmanuel prophecy, as I mentioned last week, was originally sort of a timeline, that in the time that it takes for a woman to become pregnant and have a baby and wean that baby, by then your enemies will be destroyed. But he wouldn't listen, and he didn't get destroyed, but he became dominated by the Assyrians. Now, Ahaz, so there's Ahaz. And Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah. He was regarded as a good king, and he restored temple worship and other religious reforms. He was a great reformer. He rebuilt the temple, and he had a powerful 30-year reign. So he was one of the good guys. Hezekiah became the father of Manasseh. He had a 55-year reign and went right back, reversed the religious reforms of his father, brought back polytheistic worship. Manasseh became the father of Amos, not the prophet Amos, but had the same name or was possibly Ammon. He was a bad guy. Short reign, 2 years. He continued the idolatry of his father, and he was assassinated in a revolt. And then Amos, the father of Josiah, right? He became king at age 8 because his father was assassinated, reigned for 31 years. He had religious reforms. He's the one who renovated the temple. And he also, in his reign, is the time that we can date back to the Bible, the Old Testament as we know it now, being compiled from all kinds of different writings. In other words, the Old Testament wasn't just produced from start to finish by a series of writers. It was a bunch of writings and a lot of traditions and collections of laws that were compiled. And it was about the 6th century before Christ that the major part of it was compiled and sort of put together in a collection. Josiah became the father of Jeconiah and his brothers. This was at the time of the Babylonian exile. Remember, and there were two intervening kings dethroned by the Babylonians. In 597, they were taken into exile in Babylon, and then with Jeconiah, he was one of the kings at that time. It's at this time that there was seemingly an interruption in the lineage, and it had to be kind of brought back. And Jeconiah, after the Babylonian exile, Jeconiah became the father of Shealtiel. Now, he was a king during the Babylonian exile. He was kind of one of the leaders of the people. But the genealogies differ as to who was his father. So we've got a little problematic possible disconnect there. Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel. Now we're getting back on solid ground, even though paternity is a bit of a problem. But Zerubbabel was the governor of Judah, appointed governor by Cyrus and Darius, and led the rebuilding of Jerusalem. This is a picture of Zerubbabel pointing out the plans for the rebuilding of Jerusalem to King Darius, or Darius, the Persian. Zerubbabel, the father of Abiad, we don't know, possibly he was a post-exilic prophet. Abiad, the father of Eliakim, Eliakim, the father of Azor, Azor, the father of Zadok. We have no other record of any of these people. So whether they were invented or whether there was another tradition or whatever, there's this gap where we only have some names. The name of Zadok, however, that means priest. And that may have been the origin of the Sadducees. Now, Zadok, Achim, Eliud, Eleazar, Matan, the father of Jacob. Now we're getting up to date. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Of her was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So that's the total number of generations. He's very interested in the symbolic numbers here. So he just wants everything to be nice and neat. The rest of that reading was the Gospel of last Sunday about the appearance of the angel to Mary. Let's go now, and I'll try to be relatively brief in this. Let's go now to the Mass during the day with the Gospel of John. One little word of introduction. John's Gospel begins by echoing back to Genesis. So we've got Genesis and the creation, and now John's Gospel, the recreation. And God, in Genesis, God spoke his word and all came to be. And now in John's Gospel, the word becomes flesh. So let's listen to the word.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be.
Okay, so that's a creative word. Now, from Genesis, we continue with the word and this life that came about. It's the light of the human race, and the light shines in the darkness. That darkness can't overcome it.
What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
And now, John fast forwards to John the Baptist. Not the word, not the light, but the one who would testify to him.
A man named John was sent from God. He came for testimony, to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to testify to the light.
And now we go back to the word, the true light.
The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him, but the world did not know him.
And he came into the world didn't know him. Now we've got the next level, who he came to.
He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. But to those who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not by natural generation, nor by human choice, nor by a man's decision, but of God.
Now it's interesting to compare this with the genealogy of Matthew. Matthew is concentrating on his human origins and his legal claim, according to Jewish law, to be the expected one, to be the heir of Abraham and the heir of King David. All of that takes place, of course, by natural generation, by human choice, by man's decision. But John is saying, if we take one step back and look at the reality of who Jesus was as the incarnate Word, as the Son of God, the choice was not human, but the choice was God's. Okay.
And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth.
One of the things that I always like to say about this verse is, what language does God speak? God speaks to us the language of humanity. Not Hebrew, not Aramaic, not English, not Latin, not any other language, but the language of humanity. So the Word of God becomes flesh. Just as my idea is embodied in my words, so too God's idea becomes embodied in human flesh, and that human flesh is the language of God. Okay?
John testified to him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, the one who is coming after me ranks ahead of me because he existed before me."
Okay. And
from his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace, because while the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, God, who is at the Father's side, has revealed him.
John is not so much saying that the law is now destroyed, that the law was no good, and that grace and truth came through Jesus. But rather, I think he is coming to the same conclusion that Matthew does, that Jesus is the fulfillment of what was begun. So the final word of God was not the law, but the final word was Jesus himself. Now, the first reading this coming Sunday is from Isaiah, and kind of speaks about the embodiment of that word as good news, not just for a chosen people, but for everybody. And of course, that's one of the themes of Isaiah, that is all through the book of Isaiah, that you have been chosen not just to be recipients and sort of patted on the head and spoiled, but you have been chosen for a purpose, and that is to bring salvation, to bring healing and peace and grace and union with God to all people. So, first reading.
How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings glad tidings, announcing peace, bearing good news, announcing salvation, and saying to Zion, your God is King.
And go ahead.
Hark, your sentinel raise a cry. Together they shout for joy, for they see directly before their eyes the Lord restoring Zion. Break out together in song, O ruins of Jerusalem.
And continue.
For the Lord comforts his people. He redeems Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm in the sight of all the nations. All the ends of the earth will behold the salvation of our God.
In a sense, what's happening there is God is saying, I embrace you with my love. Now, bring my love to everyone. Now, here is the second reading, which is from the beginning of the letter to the Hebrews. Okay.
Brothers and sisters, in times past, God spoke in partial and various ways to our ancestors through the prophets.
Now, we don't know who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Obviously, it was a Jewish Christian who was writing for his own brothers and sisters who were Jewish and who were seeing in Jesus Christ the fulfillment of the hopes and the expectations of the Jewish people. So, in times past, all of that was partial and varied ways through the prophets. Now,
in these last days, he has spoken to us through the Son, whom he made heir of all things, and through whom he created the universe, who is the refulgence of his glory, the very imprint of his being, and who sustains all things by his mighty word.
So, what happened in the past is partial. Now, let me tell you about what God has done now in these last days. Go ahead.
When he had accomplished purification from sins, he took his seat at the right hand of the Majesty on high, as far superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs.
Okay, he brings in angels. Now, the Jewish people were very familiar with angels, and they did a lot in the Old Testament. And most of the power of God that we see in the Old Testament was revealed through the work of angels, not directly. So, but what he's saying is, in Jesus, we ain't got no angel here. We've got the very presence of God. And he proves it by going back into what God is saying to his son in the Old Testament and saying, God doesn't treat angels this way. This is truly his son. Go ahead.
For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, this day I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be your father to him, and he shall be a son to me"?
And the absolute clincher, the last word. God bless you. Go ahead.
And again, when he leads the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all the angels of God worship him."
So what he concludes this introductory section of his letter with is that even the angels worship the Son of God, worship the one that I'm going to be talking to you about. So that's it for my presentation on the Sunday readings, on the readings for Christmas. Any thoughts or questions?
It's my understanding, at least in this time, that in order to become a citizen of Israel, your mother has to be Jewish.
Yes.
Yet, what you went through, was the father, the paternity side. And I'm wondering, since it's much more difficult to figure out who the father is than the mother, why this wasn't done on the maternal side of things?
Well, I think that's a good question. Um, and I think it basically had to do with inheritance. You know, the woman was not the householder, generally speaking, if there was a husband. It was the man who was the householder. And so it is paternity that determines the inheritance. And what we're talking about here is the legal inheritance. Now we could go into the other side of things that um, Joseph was not the true biological father of Jesus, but Mary, his mother, was his true mother. And you could make the argument about, well, why don't we concentrate on Mary? Well, legally, at that time, to be legitimate, he had to establish the paternal lineage. Now, that's very different from what happened since 1948 in the state of Israel. So don't worry too much about that. Okay, let's finish with, I'm actually pretty much on time here. It's 46 minutes that we've been going, but the last 5 or 10 minutes are going to be on the saints of the up and coming week. And we've got some very interesting ones here that I'll go through tomorrow. In the old days was St. Thomas the Apostle. Today it's St. Peter Canisius. Friday we have St. John Cancius. And on Christmas Day, there are a couple of saints that I really would like to talk about because they're very interesting. Monday, of course, we have St. Stephen, and Tuesday, St. John the Evangelist, right after Christmas. So let's go into St. Thomas. My mother's favorite brother was born on December 21st, and so he was named Thomas. I was named after him. And I have to say, as much as I accepted the reforms of Vatican II, I was really bummed when they took away my feast day, thank you very much, and moved him to July 3rd, even though I knew all the reasons for it. December 21st was traditionally the day that Thomas was martyred. But that's part of a tradition. There's another tradition that says it was July 3rd. But the detail that we actually can hang on to is that his relics were transferred from India to Edessa on July 3rd. So we'll talk more about him when we get to him in July 3rd. But I just had to express my annoyance at that particular aspect of the liturgical changes. Okay, St. Peter Canisius, he was a friend of St. Ignatius, lived right around the time of the Reformation. He was known as the second apostle of Germany. He was Dutch, actually, and at the time of the Reformation. He composed several simple catechisms, and he was the very first to use the printing press for Christian teaching. One of the things that powered the Reformation was the fact that throughout Europe, the ordinary people were not well taught, they were not well taken care of, and suddenly you had these people who were promising a rebirth and renewal of faith and truly believed in it, and the Catholics had to say, hey, wait a minute, they're doing better what we should be doing. Let's rebuild the pastoral care of people. Let's rebuild the education of the ordinary person. And St. Peter Canisius was probably one of the patrons of actually trying to bring catechetical instruction. Know your faith, the importance of knowing your faith, not just believing and putting money in the collection, but knowing your faith for the average ordinary person. And sadly, he had a stroke in I think that's 1591, not 1991, and lived for 6 years more and suffered a very long and slow death. So possibly for us too, a model of patience in having accomplished a lot of things and at the same time ending up needing to be a model of patience and endurance. John Cancius, or John Canty, was born in a small town in Poland near Auschwitz, and he was 100 or so years earlier. He was known for learning, austerity, and charity to the poor. One of the things, he doesn't, he's not one of those great ones who accomplished very significant things, but he was one who embodied both learning and piety and charity. And one of the things we find, I think, in so many saints, even especially the big intellectual ones, is that their intellect had to be matched by charity and matched by their dedication to the ordinary person, especially to the poor. And here is a statue of him that is a statue of him. On Christmas Day, we forget about, there are a couple of saints that actually do celebrate their commemoration on Christmas. One of them is Saint Anastasia, about whom very little is known except that she was a martyr in the time of Diocletian. And she was very, very popular and became associated with Epiphany and Christmas at in that time. And in the Middle Ages in Rome, the Mass at dawn, which was celebrated in her church in Rome, was called the Mass of St. Anastasia. And so we had the other Christmas Masses, and then we had the Mass of St. Anastasia commemorated at dawn. That practice has been discontinued. But the Basilica of St. Anastasia in Rome was the titular church of Cardinal McIntyre, who was a former Archbishop here in Los Angeles. And so here we have an icon of St. Anastasia coming from the Greek Byzantine times. Also on Christmas Day is Jacopone di Todi. And he was a Franciscan shortly after the time of St. Francis. And he had an abusive upbringing. His father beat him regularly, and it left him with, as so often happens, sadly, lifelong guilt because he wished his father dead. After his father died, he was very remorseful. He was intelligent, but he was wild, he was wealthy, he was worldly. He married, and his wife died tragically soon after. And they discovered after she died at a wedding celebration a year after they were married, and the balcony collapsed. And she was the only one who was on that balcony who was killed. And when they prepared her body for burial, it was discovered that she was wearing a hair shirt for penance. Possibly doing penance, we don't know, possibly doing penance for the conversion of her husband. But he was shattered, and he didn't know what to do. He gave up everything, and he became the town crazy man for a number of years. Finally, seeking peace, he joined the Franciscans and became a poet. He was still eccentric, but he was his big fame is that he wrote the Stabat Mater that we sing at the Stations of the Cross during Lent. And here's a picture of him. I guess he wrote a large body of poetry that's published by the Paulist Press also. Then the day after Christmas, good King Wenceslas went out on the Feast of Stephen, he was one of the first, Stephen was one of the first 7 deacons, served the needs of the Greek-speaking community. An eloquent preacher, his preaching got him in trouble, and he was the first one who was put to death for his preaching Christ Jesus. And at that point, the persecution of the Greek-speaking Christians began in earnest, and many of them had to flee. A lot of them fled to Samaria, and then from there fled to Antioch. And it was in Antioch that the evangelization, the spread of the gospel, really took fire. But one of the interesting things I think about Stephen is that his martyrdom kind of spurred all of the apostles to get out of their comfort zone and to bring Christ to those who needed him. Here is an artistic, an icon representation of the stoning of Stephen. And then the last one, next Tuesday, a week from today, will be John the Evangelist. Now, traditionally, John the Evangelist is the disciple whom Jesus loved, as recounted in John's Gospel, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, that Jesus called by the Sea of Galilee, the author of the fourth Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the author of 3 New Testament letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the author of the book of Revelation. Many scholars today will say that they all may have been different. Certainly, there is only indirect tradition, but it's a strong tradition, that John actually was the disciple that Jesus loved. And that the author of the fourth Gospel, if he was the disciple Jesus loved, we're not really sure that he was the brother of James, the son of Zebedee. And the 3 New Testament letters carry a lot of the same theme as the Gospel. But the author of the book of Revelation are almost certain from a lot of internal evidence that John was not the John who wrote the Gospel. So, nonetheless, we celebrate all of them, and that's good. Traditionally, too, Ignatius of Antioch, Papias of Hierapolis, and Polycarp of Smyrna, 3 saints, in the next generation were disciples of John. And at least Irenaeus of Lyon mentions that he was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John. So John is responsible for a particular strain of the traditions that came from the first and second generation of Christians, and third. Tradition also is that he took Mary to Ephesus and built her a home there on the slope of Mount Nightingale, which I've been to a number of times and celebrated Mass there. And it's a very, very interesting and beautiful location. Here's the reconstruction, actually, of the traditional place. There you can see a little bit of a red line there. That red line goes around the whole building. That was the foundation that was discovered. Everything above that red line is actually reconstruction. But it's a 2-room, 2 rooms with an entryway and a small exit that may have been a kitchen in addition. And it's a beautiful building in a beautiful place. And I personally, while I tend to be skeptical of that sort of thing and of private revelations, I personally do think that there is a strong ring of authenticity in this tradition and in this location. And so with that, just under an hour, I thank you very, very much, and Merry Christmas.
And to you, Father.
Thank you, and God bless you.